I never thought that night, which seemed so peaceful, would become the worst nightmare of my life. If I had known what was coming, I would have done anything to avoid being alone at home. Everything began as a normal evening. My parents had gone away for the weekend, and for the first time, I was alone. At first, I felt free, almost excited by the sensation of having the house all to myself. Nothing seemed out of place. I was on the couch, relaxing, flipping through TV channels without really paying attention to what was on. The silence in the house, combined with the soft sound of the wind outside, brought a strange sense of peace. Only the light from the TV illuminated the room, casting shadows on the walls that, for some reason, seemed more unsettling that night. I glanced at the clock in the corner of the screen. It was a little past 10. Everything was so quiet, so normal. Until that moment, that's when the intercom rang. The sudden, sharp sound made me jump, my heart racing with fright. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at that hour. I got up from the couch, feeling a growing discomfort as I walked to the device. Deep down, a small voice inside me was already saying something wasn't right, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a neighbor or a wrong delivery. Something simple, nothing to worry about. I just needed to answer. I paused for a moment in front of the intercom, my hand hesitant before pressing the button. While I waited to hear the voice on the other side, I tried to calm myself. But something about the way the sound echoed through the house, in that near-total silence, made me more nervous than I wanted to admit. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the irrational fear. I was just overreacting, or at least, that's what I hoped. With a trembling hand, I finally answered the intercom. "Hello?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but the tension was already building inside me. On the other side, only silence. The kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I didn't know it yet, but that simple ring on the intercom would mark the beginning of a series of events that would completely change my sense of security. Still with my heart racing, I heard a male voice on the other side. "Do the Johnsons live here?" The question sounded odd, unexpected, but it seemed like someone lost. I took a deep breath before responding. "No, you're at the wrong place," I said cautiously. The man's voice seemed to hesitate for a second before replying, "Oh, sorry. Must have been a mistake." The sound of the intercom clicking off was almost a relief, and I went back to the couch, trying to convince myself it was just a mix-up. Even so, there was something about his voice that kept echoing in my mind. Maybe it was the tone, or the fact that he seemed to know he was at the right place. I couldn't explain it, but a slight sense of unease began to grow inside me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the TV and convincing myself I was overreacting. People get lost all the time, right? Sometimes they just go to the wrong address, especially in a neighborhood like mine, where the houses all look alike. However, that strange sense of discomfort wouldn't leave me alone. I tried to settle back on the couch, attempting to relax and focus on what was on TV, but my thoughts kept returning to the intercom. I tried to push away the feeling that something was wrong, but the more I tried, the stronger it became. Why would someone be looking for the Johnsons at that hour? I didn't know anyone with that last name in my neighborhood. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Then the intercom rang again. This time, the sound seemed even louder, slicing through the house's silence like a blade. My nerves, already on edge, ignited completely. I stood up faster than I'd like to admit and, for a second, I thought about not answering. But curiosity and the need to resolve this forced me back to the intercom. Maybe he's really lost, I thought, trying to calm myself. When I answered, the same male voice asked the same question. "Do the Johnsons live here?" This time, the tone sounded more insistent, as if he already knew the answer but was testing my reaction. "I already told you no. You're at the wrong place," I replied, now feeling irritation mixed with discomfort. Before he could answer, I quickly hung up. Something was definitely wrong, and at that moment, I realized that night was far from as peaceful as I had imagined. I sat back on the couch, but now I couldn't focus on anything. The TV was on, but the images and sounds went unnoticed. My mind was focused on that man and the strange repetition of the same question. Something about the tone of his voice made me uncomfortable, as if he was provoking me, trying to elicit a reaction. The silence in the house, which had once relaxed me, now felt oppressive, heavy. It was becoming harder to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. The truth is, I couldn't shake the idea that the man knew he was at the right address. His insistence on the question, the slightly firmer tone the second time, it seemed like he wanted something, and the fact that I was alone at home made the situation much worse. I forced myself to think that maybe he was just a strange guy or someone with issues, but it was impossible to deny that the doubt was starting to turn into fear, and the thought of answering the intercom again made my stomach churn. I tried to push the dark thoughts away, focusing on the TV, but soon realized it was useless. I was completely engulfed by the discomfort that now surrounded me. Every sound in the house, the creaking of the walls, the groaning of the furniture in the wind, made me flinch, as if expecting the intercom to ring again at any moment. And of course, that's exactly what happened. The sound cut through the air in the room like a sharp blade, leaving me paralyzed for a moment. It couldn't be him again. I got up slowly, my heart pounding, and walked over to the intercom, hesitating for a few seconds before answering. When I finally pressed the button, the same voice came through, now with a more intense, almost accusatory tone. "This is where the Johnsons live, isn't it?" This time, the way he asked made my skin crawl. There was a certainty in his voice that wasn't there before. He knew I was lying, or at least, that's what he wanted me to believe. "I told you no. Stop calling." I hung up, but the discomfort had now turned into a palpable fear. The night was no longer peaceful. The sound of the intercom still echoed in my head, and the certainty that something was very wrong grew inside me. The feeling of being watched, that the man wasn't just going to leave, settled over me like a shadow. I sat on the couch, but now I couldn't stay still. Something was about to happen. I could feel it. The intercom rang again, as I knew it would. This time, the sound seemed longer, more insistent, as if the man on the other end was pressing the button repeatedly, harder each time. I didn't get up. I decided I wouldn't answer anymore. Fear now consumed me, and the simple thought of hearing his voice again made my stomach turn. But the intercom kept ringing, echoing through the empty house. I could feel panic growing inside me, like an electric current keeping me frozen on the couch. The intercom stopped for a second, and I thought he had finally given up. But the relief was short-lived. The sound started again, now at an even more frantic pace, almost desperate. Each ring seemed louder than the last, and the persistence was impossible to ignore. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but the noise wouldn't stop. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it in the silence of the room, competing with the sound of the intercom. It was as if he knew I was there, listening, too scared to answer. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to unplug the intercom completely, to end the noise that was tormenting me. But another part, the more terrified part, was afraid to do that, as if disconnecting the intercom was an invitation for him to try something even scarier. Maybe he was testing my limits, waiting for me to react in some way. I didn't know what this man wanted, but the feeling that he was playing a game with me was unbearable. The intercom stopped again, and I used the silence to take a deep breath, trying to regain some control over the situation. But the silence, which once felt like a blessing, now felt oppressive. I looked toward the door, expecting something to happen, and the weight of loneliness hit me hard. I was completely alone, with no one to call for help, and somehow, that made everything feel much more real. It was at that moment that I made a decision. I couldn't stand this game any longer. I got up, determined to put an end to it once and for all. I went to the intercom, took a deep breath, and completely unplugged the device. The silence that followed was overwhelming, as if the entire house was holding its breath with me. I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm myself. At least now, that infernal noise had stopped, but the discomfort, the feeling that something was lurking, only got worse. And that's when I started to realize the worst was yet to come. The silence that followed after unplugging the intercom was almost deafening. For a moment, the calm returned, but it wasn't true relief. The weight of the house seemed to suffocate me, and the darkness outside the windows, illuminated only by the TV's reflection, made me even more uneasy. I sat on the couch, trying to convince myself I had made the right decision. After all, the intercom was off. He couldn't bother me anymore. right? But the truth was, the house now seemed much more sinister, wrapped in this suffocating silence. Every sound seemed amplified. The soft creak of the furniture in the wind, the occasional noise from old pipes, the rustling of leaves outside. I tried to distract myself, but my mind couldn't stray from what had happened. Who was that man? Why was he so insistent? And more importantly, how did he know I was here? The discomfort was quickly turning into real fear, the kind that tightens your muscles and makes your stomach churn. The feeling of being watched only grew worse. Time seemed to pass slowly, each second dragging on as if the clock were against me. I tried to convince myself I was safe, that I had turned off the intercom, and therefore, the man had no way of disturbing me anymore. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The idea that he might try something else, knocking on the door, attempting to break in, pounded in my mind. With every sound outside, my breath quickened. And that's when the unexpected happened. The doorbell rang. I froze. The sharp sound of the doorbell, so unexpected and so direct, made my body tense up immediately. I knew it couldn't be anyone else. The man was now at my door, and somehow, that was far more terrifying than the intercom. He was there. I didn't know how to react. My initial instinct was to run to the door and lock it with all my strength, but I was paralyzed, unable to decide what to do. It was as if my mind was in shock. I got up slowly, my legs trembling, and walked to the door. My breathing was heavy, and my heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. I pressed my eye against the peephole with shaking hands, and what I saw made a cold chill run down my spine. Outside, on the porch, a motionless figure was standing, holding something in his hand. Even though I couldn't see his face clearly, I knew it was him. On the other side of the door, the man stood still, barely moving, except for his hand, which was holding something. And then I realized with horror what it was. He was holding the intercom I had unplugged. How he got it, I had no idea, but just seeing him there, holding that device in his hands, made me feel like the ground was falling out from under me. Every detail of that moment was etched into my mind. The man's calm posture, the darkness around him, and the neutral, almost blank, expression on his face. I immediately backed away, terror washing over me. He knew I was inside, watching him, and he wasn't in a hurry. It was as if he was just waiting for me to react. My thoughts were scattered. All I could think about was that I needed to get out of there, but there was nowhere to run. My home, once a place of refuge, now felt like a prison. And he was there, just outside, as if he had all the time in the world. The doorbell rang again. This time, longer, almost like a continuous, desperate ring. My body was in full alert mode. I knew I couldn't just wait for him to leave. It was clear he wasn't going to give up. I tried to think of a solution, but panic kept me frozen. That's when I heard the first knock. It was firm, controlled, but with an intensity that made the sound reverberate through the house. Each knock came with a cruel calmness, as if he knew that with every sound, my fear was growing. I backed away even more from the door, feeling my body tremble with terror. I couldn't believe this was happening. Suddenly, I heard a low sound, almost a whisper from the other side of the door. "I know you're in there." Those words, spoken so softly, hit my mind like a hammer. He knew. He was watching me, playing with me, waiting for the right moment. My instinct was screaming at me to run, to lock all the doors, to flee from this nightmare. But what could I do? There was no way to leave without going past him. I needed help, but my mind was a mess. I looked around, searching for something to protect myself, but the only clear thought I had was to grab my phone. With shaking hands, I called the police. The wait as the phone rang felt like an eternity, and the knocking on the door, slow and rhythmic, didn't stop. He was trying to break me, and it was working. The knocks on the door continued, steady and slow, each one pounding louder in my ears. As I waited, with the phone pressed to my ear, the feeling of dread only increased. The voice of the 911 operator finally came through, but even then, I could barely speak. "Someone's trying to break into my house," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "He's at my door now, knocking. I don't know what to do." The words stumbled out as I stared at the door. as if it were about to explode any second. "We're sending a patrol car immediately. Stay in a safe place and don't open the door." The operator's voice was quick and practical, but the fear made it hard for me to process any instructions clearly. "How long?" I could barely form the question. "Hold on, they're on their way," he replied. But the answer didn't bring the relief I desperately wanted. The knocking continued, each one sounding louder than the last. The figure outside seemed tireless. With every sound, every blow against the wood, my panic grew. My body trembled uncontrollably, and each second felt like an eternity. The man's voice from the intercom still echoed in my mind. "I know you're in there." That phrase echoed like an evil mantra as I tried to decide what to do. I knew I needed to move away from the door, to find a safe place in the house, but his presence, so close, kept me frozen. What did he want? Why was he doing this to me? I couldn't find a logical explanation. The fear had taken full control, and my only thought was survival. That's when, suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. The absence of sound made me hold my breath. Could he have given up? Maybe the police were getting close. But something inside me told me it wasn't over. And I was right. Just a few seconds later, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. It came from the kitchen. My heart stopped for a moment, then started racing. The man had found another way in. He was inside the house. As soon as I heard the glass break, I went into full panic. My feet moved before I even realized what I was doing. I ran down the hallway, heading straight for the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I pressed my back against the wood, trying to catch my breath as I listened to the sound of heavy footsteps downstairs. He was inside. My whole body was shaking, and my eyes frantically scanned the room, searching for an escape. But there was none. I was trapped. The footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, each one closer than the last. He was walking slowly, as if savoring every second of the game. Each thud of his feet on the ground seemed to mock me. I could picture the smile on his face, the pleasure he was taking in hunting me. The sound of footsteps climbing the stairs made me stifle a scream. He was coming for me, without hurry, but with a cruel certainty. I grabbed my phone and whispered desperately to the police. He's in the house, please hurry." I could barely breathe as I spoke, trying not to make a sound so he wouldn't hear me. The response came quickly, but it seemed distant. "Officers are on the way. Stay safe. Lock yourself in a room." I had already done that, but safety was an illusion. I knew the bedroom door wouldn't stop him. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. The silence was even more terrifying than the footsteps. He was there, standing, just a few feet away from me, with only a thin door separating us. A second passed, and then he started knocking. The wood shook with the force of the blows, each knock pushing me closer to total despair. I knew he was about to break in, and there was nowhere for me to run. That's when the police sirens echoed down the street. The red and blue lights flooded through the windows, casting fast-moving shadows across the walls of the bedroom. For a second, everything stopped. The knocking ceased. The footsteps grew faster, and I heard the sound of something breaking again. He was trying to escape through the same window he had used to enter. I remained pressed against the door, unable to move, until the police officers entered the house. They found me huddled on the floor of the bedroom, still shaking, the fear still gripping my chest like a cold hand. The man had vanished, disappeared into the darkness of the night. The intruder, the stranger who had terrorized me all night, escaped without a trace. Even with the police assuring me that he had fled, the relief never fully came. What did he want from me? Who was he? Those questions would continue to haunt me. The house felt emptier than ever. I was safe, but the terror of that night, the sound of the knocks, and the expressionless face of the man at the intercom would never leave me again. If I had known what was about to happen, I might not have gone to bed so early that night. My routine had always been the same, almost like a personal safety ritual. Living alone had taught me to be careful, always ensuring that all doors and windows were locked before I slept. I used to check everything twice, more out of habit than out of real fear. That day, after a long day at work, all I wanted was to relax and rest, believing I was completely safe. The apartment I live in isn't big, but it's comfortable. Every corner of the place is etched in my memory. The organized furniture, the always locked windows, the front door with its chain and extra lock. It's my fortress, a place where I've always felt in control. As I checked the locks one last time, I felt that familiar relief that comes from knowing everything is in order. It was a routine that gave me peace, a way to disconnect from the outside world. After making sure everything was as it should be, I walked to the bedroom, changed into my pajamas, and lay down. The silence of the apartment always relaxed me, and the feeling of being in control of everything was comforting. The first few minutes in bed were always the best, when my mind began to shut down and I could finally rest. I couldn't have imagined that this sense of security would be so fragile that night. As I was drifting off to sleep, something made me open my eyes. It was subtle, a faint sound coming from the other side of the apartment, like a light creak. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it could be the building's structure or the wind. Something trivial that didn't deserve my attention. Even so, that small sound stuck in my mind, something I couldn't completely dismiss. I closed my eyes, determined to brush it off, but a strange feeling was bothering me. I couldn't explain it, but something about that night felt different. Despite all the security, a subtle discomfort began to creep in. I decided to ignore it, trying to convince myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but I was about to find out how wrong I was. I woke up in the middle of the night to a more distinct noise this time. It was the sound of something moving, a door slowly opening. My heart raced instantly. It wasn't just any door. It was the bathroom door, the one I always leave closed and, of course, locked. I turned in bed, my eyes still heavy with sleep, but fear was already taking over. What was that? I tried to convince myself that maybe I had forgotten to lock the door, but the doubt had already set in. I got up slowly, feeling the cold floor under my feet as I walked down the hallway to the bathroom. The door was ajar, which didn't make sense. I always check everything before going to bed. The hallway light partially illuminated the bathroom, and the fear of finding something unexpected made me hesitate before opening the door completely. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but my body was tense, ready to react to whatever it was. I opened the door slowly, the soft creak cutting through the silence of the house. To my relief, no one was there. No sign of a break-in or anything unusual, except for the fact that the door was unlocked. A mix of relief and confusion washed over me. Maybe I really had been distracted before going to sleep. Sometimes the mind plays tricks, and after a long day, it was easy to imagine that I could have overlooked something. Still, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I went back to the bedroom, but the tranquility I had before was gone. I lay back down, trying to fall asleep again, but the thought that something had changed kept me on edge. Why was the door unlocked? And what was the sound that woke me? These were questions I tried to silence, but the discomfort remained. I closed my eyes, but the thought that someone might be in the apartment, someone I hadn't seen yet, kept me awake for a long time. Even hours later, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little sound in the apartment made my body react, as if expecting something more. That night, sleep became impossible, and the security I had always felt in my apartment seemed to have dissolved, as if an invisible presence had taken over the place. In the days that followed, I tried to resume my routine, convincing myself that the unlocked door incident had just been a slip of my mind. But as the days passed, I began to notice small changes in the apartment that I couldn't explain. At first, they were simple things, so subtle that I almost didn't notice them. A chair that seemed to be at a slightly different angle, a glass on the coffee table that I was sure I had placed in the kitchen. Everything seemed out of place, but never enough for me to be certain something was really wrong. The worst part was that I tried to ignore these details, but the feeling of unease grew every time something was out of place. I'd come home from work and find a door slightly open, even though I knew I'd closed it before leaving. Once, the living room window was unlocked, something I never did. It disturbed me, but I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe I was distracted. Maybe fatigue was causing my mind to play tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was happening, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more the fear grew. Each passing day seemed to heighten my paranoia. I found myself checking the doors and windows repeatedly, always with the feeling that someone had tampered with them. There were no signs of forced entry or any clear evidence that someone had broken into the apartment, but the feeling that something was off was undeniable. I started to doubt myself. Was I becoming paranoid? Was I imagining things that weren't really happening? It was hard to stay calm when everything around me seemed to be subtly altered, and the feeling that I wasn't alone began to take hold of me more intensely. At night, I'd lie in bed, trying to sleep, but every small noise put me on alert. I started leaving the lights on in some rooms, as if that might ward off the growing unease. Yet, even with the lights, the fear that something, or someone, was tampering with my things only increased. I knew I needed to do something, but I couldn't decide what. There were no clear signs that I was in real danger, but the discomfort was consuming me. The changes in the apartment were small but constant, and my mind wouldn't let me forget that something was deeply wrong. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it felt like the apartment itself was trying to warn me that something wasn't right. But what was it? And why were these changes happening? The feeling that I was being watched started as a slight discomfort, a small irritation that I could easily brush off. But as the days passed, that feeling intensified to the point where I could no longer ignore it. I felt watched all the time. Even when I was alone in the apartment, with all the doors locked, I had the sense that I wasn't truly alone. It was as if there was an invisible presence, something I couldn't see, but that was always lurking. The nights, especially, became unbearable. I started hearing small sounds in the middle of the night, light footsteps, almost as if someone were walking through the apartment. At first, I tried to convince myself it was the building, the sound of pipes, or the wind, but the intensity of the noises increased with each passing night. It was as if someone was moving silently, trying not to be noticed. I couldn't see anything, but the sounds were clear enough to keep me awake, my heart racing. I started getting up at night to check the rooms. My heart would pound every time I opened a door, afraid of what I might find, or who I might find. But every time I looked, there was nothing. The house was empty, just as I had left it. Even so, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger every night. The fear that someone was there, hiding in some place I hadn't yet discovered, kept me on the edge of despair. I didn't know what to do anymore. Each day became a battle between logic and fear. My mind told me I was safe, that the doors were locked and no one could get in. But my body, my instincts, told me otherwise. Every little shift in the apartment seemed to have a hidden meaning, as if something was trying to make me notice its presence. I felt more and more vulnerable, as if I were being watched by eyes I couldn't see. That's when I realized I couldn't go on like this. The fear was consuming me, and the feeling that something was deeply wrong was preventing me from living normally. I knew I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. I had to do something to figure out what was happening. I could no longer convince myself it was just paranoia. Something was there with me, and I needed to find out what it was before it was too late. Each new day in the apartment brought more unease. The paranoia had taken deep root inside me, and I no longer trusted even my own perception. Every night before bed, I checked every door, every window, locking and double-checking everything, sometimes even 3 times. The simple act of locking things no longer brought me the comfort it used to. Something was different. The apartment, once my safe refuge, had turned into a place where fear seemed to hide in the shadows. I had developed the habit of waking up several times during the night, always alert to any sound, any movement. Even though everything seemed in order, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The noises continued. Sometimes they were soft footsteps, as if someone were walking down the hall. Other times, it was the creaking of doors, as if they were being lightly touched. The fear was constant, and even when I tried to convince myself I was safe, my body reacted as if I were in imminent danger. My routine was no longer the same. I started avoiding leaving the house late at night, and when I returned from work, the first thing I did was check if the furniture was in its proper place, if the chairs were exactly where I had left them. But even with all the care, the small changes persisted. Objects out of place, doors I was certain I had closed now slightly open. Each passing day convinced me more that someone or something was messing with my apartment. And the worst part, I didn't know how or through where. I felt like I was on the verge of a breakdown. It wasn't possible that all of this was just my imagination. I tried to convince myself I was merely tired, that the stress from work was affecting my judgment. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the issue. The feeling that someone was in the apartment, someone entering without me realizing, tormented me every second. I could no longer ignore it. I needed concrete proof that something was truly happening. That's when I decided to take action. I needed to know, once and for all, what was moving my things. The idea of installing security cameras seemed like the only plausible solution. If someone was indeed entering my apartment, the cameras would catch everything. The idea of discovering the truth terrified me, but the uncertainty was destroying me even more. I couldn't live in doubt any longer. It was time to find out the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. With the security cameras installed in strategic spots around the apartment, I felt a small sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control of the situation. The cameras would stay on all night, recording any movement, anything that might be happening while I slept. I made sure to cover every room, living room, kitchen, hallway, and even the bedroom. If someone or something was indeed messing with my things, I would see it with my own eyes. That night, I lay down with a strange sense of vigilance. I knew the cameras were recording everything, and in a way, that gave me a false sense of security. I convinced myself that I was protected, that nothing could happen without me knowing. And for the first time in a long time, I managed to sleep for several hours straight without waking at every small noise. The constant surveillance of the cameras made me believe I was in control. However, deep down, that persistent feeling that something was wrong remained. The house was quieter than usual, and even with the protection of the cameras, I couldn't fully relax. It was as if I knew, unconsciously, that something was about to happen. The idea of reviewing the footage made me nervous, but at the same time, I needed the confirmation that I was safe. I needed to know that all those fears were nothing more than paranoia. When I woke up the next morning, I rushed to the computer. The night had been unusually calm, without the usual noises. I expected to find the recordings empty, with nothing suspicious, but my heart raced with the anticipation of what I might see. I turned on the computer, downloaded the files, and started reviewing the footage from the previous night. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just me sleeping, the dark, empty living room, everything in order. But then, the impossible happened. In one of the recordings, around 3 a.m., I noticed a slight movement on the ceiling of the living room. It was something small, almost imperceptible, but it made my whole body freeze. The camera had captured a subtle shadow moving in the upper corner of the screen. I paused the video, and with my heart pounding, zoomed in on the image. That's when I saw it. A small opening in the ceiling, one I had never noticed before, began to move. Someone, or something, was up there, hiding. My blood ran cold as I saw a hand emerge from that secret compartment, followed by a human figure slowly climbing down into the living room. That person, who until that moment I didn't know existed, was in my apartment, watching, moving around without me ever noticing. At that moment, fear took over me in a way I had never experienced before. The nightmare I had feared had become reality, and the worst part was, I didn't know how long they had been there. My hands trembled as I continued watching the footage. The man, slowly climbing out of the ceiling compartment, descended with a chilling calm, as if it were part of his nightly ritual. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. He moved around the apartment with an unsettling tranquility, walking through the living room and heading to the kitchen. The entire time, he was just exploring, as if the apartment were his. Fear gripped me, my whole body frozen by the revelation. As I watched, it felt like reality was unraveling around me. That ceiling compartment, I didn't even know it existed. How could someone have been up there, so close to me, without me ever noticing? The camera captured every movement of the intruder, and my heart raced faster and faster as I saw the man approach my bedroom. He stopped at the door for a moment, watching through the crack, as if to make sure I was still asleep. The camera captured my silhouette, still in bed, oblivious to the terrifying presence at the door. That's when I realized how close I had been to danger. That man, that stranger, could have done anything to me while I slept, and I would never have known. The nights I had spent hearing noises, feeling like something was wrong. It all made sense now. He had been there the whole time, watching, messing with my things. I felt exposed, violated, as if the safety of my home had been cruelly and insidiously stripped away. My breathing was rapid as, in the video, the man returned to the ceiling compartment, closing the opening as if nothing had happened. I paused the video, my body shaking with pure terror. He was in the apartment with me while I watched those images. He was still up there, hiding, and now, all I could think about was how to get out of there without him knowing. The fear was suffocating, and every second felt like an eternity. I needed to act fast. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and called the police. The wait was agonizing. My voice came out shaky, almost unintelligible, as I explained the situation. "There's someone in my apartment. He's hiding. He comes out at night." The words barely came out, panic starting to overwhelm my senses. The dispatcher said the police were on their way, but the wait felt endless, and I knew that at any moment, he could come down again. I needed to hide. I needed to buy time. As I waited, every sound in the apartment put me on high alert. I knew he was up there, in the ceiling compartment, but the uncertainty of when he might come out consumed me. The oppressive silence made me even more nervous. The slightest noise, a creak, made me imagine he was about to come down. I couldn't stay in the same place any longer. The terror of seeing him again, of being confronted by that intruder, paralyzed me. But at the same time, I knew I had to do something before it was too late. I ran to the bedroom and locked the door, pressing myself against it as if that could protect me. My whole body trembled, and my ears were attuned to any sign of movement. Time seemed to have stopped. The police sirens, which I desperately hoped to hear, still hadn't arrived. What would I do if he came down again? That was the question that kept running through my mind. And what if he knew I had discovered him? The thought of facing that man filled me with an indescribable terror. Then, I heard it. A faint dragging sound from the ceiling, almost imperceptible, but it made my blood run cold. He was moving. My mind raced in all directions. Did he know I had seen the footage? Was he planning to come down again? The idea that I was trapped in the apartment with him, with few options for escape, consumed me. My only hope was that the police would arrive in time. Every minute that passed felt like an endless nightmare. I could hear faint noises, sounds of movement above me, and I knew he was there, waiting, planning. When the police sirens finally broke the silence, the sense of relief was overwhelming, but fear still held me captive. The police entered the building, and I ran to the door, unlocking it with trembling hands. The officers arrived quickly, but the fear that something could go wrong still lingered in the air. They searched the apartment. When they climbed up to the ceiling compartment, they found the small maintenance space. It wasn't large, but enough for someone to hide. One of the officers looked at me, serious, and said, "He's been here for a while." They didn't know exactly how long the man had been there, but the evidence was clear. He had been using the compartment to hide, coming out at night and exploring the apartment while I slept. I was terrified, unable to comprehend how something like this could have happened to me. The man wasn't found that night. He had escaped before the police arrived. The discovery that he had been there, watching me, moving my belongings, living secretly in my apartment, was horrifying. And despite the relief of knowing he was no longer there, the fear continued to consume me. The question I couldn't shake from my mind was, how many nights had he spent there, watching me? Even after the police left, the feeling of safety never returned. The intruder had disappeared into the night, but the sense that he could come back, that he knew everything about me and my apartment, never left me. I knew that even with all the doors locked, security was an illusion, and the invisible presence of that man would continue to haunt every corner of my house and my mind. If someone had told me that the apartment above mine had been vacant for months, I would never have believed it. On the first night, the noises were subtle, almost like someone was simply rearranging furniture or hurriedly walking back and forth. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, firm, rhythmic footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a new neighbor, maybe settling into the space. But for some reason, the sound seemed out of sync with logic. I live alone on the top floor of an old building, and while the place has its share of peculiarities, occasional creaks and old pipes that sometimes clatter, I've never had issues with noises from other apartments. That night, the sound started around 11. I thought about ignoring them, assuming whoever it was would soon finish whatever they were doing. But as the minutes passed, the noises continued. I grew curious, wondering who could be moving in at that hour. The next morning, while waiting for the elevator, I saw the doorman and took the opportunity to ask about the new tenant upstairs. He looked at me with surprise before replying, "The floor above is empty, Miss Moore. No one's lived there since last year." Those words chilled me to the core. How could it be vacant? I was sure I had heard someone moving furniture for hours the previous night. My mind began to spin with various explanations, but none made sense. I tried not to let it disturb me. Maybe the doorman was misinformed, or there was some maintenance work going on. Even so, the uncomfortable feeling that something was off stayed with me all day. That evening, as I prepared for bed, I felt apprehensive. Part of me expected to hear those strange noises again, but I tried to convince myself it was all a coincidence. Perhaps I was overthinking it, but deep down, I knew reality wouldn't be that simple. What happened that night proved that I was right to be suspicious. Around midnight, the noises began again. Footsteps, furniture being dragged, and this time, a new sound mixed in. A whispering voice, too faint to understand but present enough to send chills down my spine. The empty apartment, according to the doorman, now seemed more alive than ever. Lying in bed, I tried to ignore the sounds coming from above. The furniture dragging no longer bothered me as much as the voice. It was as if someone was speaking, but the words made no sense, like a distant murmur, intentionally muffled. My ears strained to catch what was being said, but the voice remained unintelligible. It must be my imagination, I thought, but the truth was, fear was starting to creep into every thought. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that all of this was the result of accumulated fatigue. Maybe the stress from work was making me more sensitive, more susceptible to normal building noises. However, every time I neared sleep, the voice seemed to intensify, as if it were trying to reach something, trying to pull me into a state of total alertness. The discomfort inside me grew, and the idea that something was wrong upstairs became impossible to ignore. I decided to get up and check what could be happening. I knew the apartment above was empty, but maybe there was a logical explanation. Perhaps it was old plumbing or wind against the walls. With that in mind, I went to the door and listened. The sounds were louder now, as if the footsteps and voice were directly above me, following my every move. A shiver ran down my spine. The thought that someone could be in the empty apartment crept into my mind, making it hard to push away the fear. I returned to bed, trying to control my breathing and calm my racing heart. I could hear the footsteps, lighter now, but the voice, it was louder. The feeling that someone was whispering directly above me was overwhelming. Still, I couldn't understand what they were saying, as if there was a purpose in those words I wasn't meant to comprehend. My entire body tensed, and the discomfort that was once just a mild concern had now transformed into a growing fear. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound, every whisper, seemed to echo in my mind. The fear that something or someone was in the empty apartment above wouldn't leave me. And as I tossed and turned in bed, trying to calm my nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was calling to me, in a way that I still couldn't understand. Trying to ignore the sounds became an impossible task. Every night was the same. The dragging of furniture, the footsteps, and, most disturbingly, the whispering voice that seemed to come closer each time. Every noise amplified the fear inside me, and despite all attempts to rationalize, my body reacted automatically. My heart raced, my skin prickled, and the sense that something was dangerously wrong took over. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was pure, growing fear, as if I were slowly being surrounded. I couldn't sleep anymore. Each night, I felt more exhausted, more mentally worn out. I began to hear the sounds even before they actually happened, as if my body was in a constant state of alert. The apartment above seemed to have a life of its own, completely disregarding the logic of being vacant. The heavy footsteps, the furniture being dragged, as if someone were rearranging the space, and the voice, now more insistent, as if trying to tell me something I couldn't comprehend, consumed me. The worst part was the growing proximity of the sounds. Before, they seemed distant, as if confined to the floor above. Now, I could swear they were coming directly from the ceiling above my bedroom, as if the sound was slowly getting closer to me, night after night. The voice, especially, haunted me. I couldn't understand the words, but the cadence, the rhythm, suggested it was communication, and it was directed at me. I felt like I was being called, pulled towards something I didn't want to understand. My mind started to play tricks on me. My imagination ran wild, and terrifying thoughts invaded my head. I thought about who, or what could be up there. And what if it wasn't just a person? What if it was something else? These thoughts paralyzed me with fear, and the idea that I was being watched became increasingly persistent. I knew something was out of the ordinary, but I didn't know what to do to confront it. Each night, the fear grew more, to the point of consuming me completely. It was obvious I couldn't go on living like this for much longer. I needed to do something, but the fear of directly confronting whatever was causing this kept me from taking any immediate action. Still, I knew I had no choice. This torment had to end. I needed to find out what was happening upstairs, even if the truth was more terrifying than the noises haunting me. But what would I find there? After days of being tormented by the sounds, I couldn't take it anymore. That voice, those footsteps, they were driving me crazy. The idea of going upstairs terrified me, but curiosity and desperation mixed in a way that made it unavoidable. I had to find out what was happening, or I would never have peace. That night, I gathered my courage. I waited until the building was quiet, until all the neighbors were asleep, then slowly climbed the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. With each step, the feeling that I was about to do something terribly wrong intensified. When I finally reached the hallway of the top floor, the silence was oppressive. There were no more sounds, no footsteps, no whispers. For a moment, I thought about turning back, abandoning this insane idea, but the need for answers pushed me forward. The door to the apartment, where the sounds had been coming from for days, stood in front of me. To my surprise, it was slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat. How was this possible? The building was empty. The doorman told me no one lived there. Yet the door swayed gently, as if someone had just passed through it. My hand trembled as I cautiously pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, as if it hadn't been moved in a long time. The sight before me made me freeze. The apartment was completely empty. There was no furniture, no signs of life. The place was deserted, covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had stepped foot in there for years. And yet, I knew the sounds that had tormented me for so many nights had come from here. I took a few hesitant steps inside, my body on high alert. There was nothing there, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was undeniable. Every cell in my body screamed for me to leave, but still, I continued, almost as if I were being pushed by an invisible force. That's when I heard it again. The whispering voice, low and menacing, echoed inside the empty apartment, sounding even closer. A chill ran down my spine, and fear took over. The voice wasn't coming from far away. It was here, inside the apartment. Without thinking twice, I ran toward the door, my heart racing. I rushed down the stairs as fast as I could, feeling the presence of whatever had been haunting me getting closer. I locked the door to my apartment in a panic, every muscle tense. But I knew locking the door wouldn't protect me. Whatever was up there, it was getting closer. The next day, I woke up with my body still tense, as if every cell in my body had been on high alert since the previous night. The sounds of last night and the discovery of the empty apartment haunted me throughout the day, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I tried to go about my routine, but it was impossible to focus. At work, everything seemed out of place, out of focus. Every sudden noise, every sound that would have gone unnoticed before, startled me. I was being consumed by the idea that what I had heard was far beyond what I could comprehend. The thought of the door to the apartment upstairs being open wouldn't leave my mind. How was that possible? The doorman had said it was vacant, that no one had lived there for months, and yet, something, or someone, was present. My mind tried to come up with answers, but none of them seemed rational. All I could think was that whatever that presence was, that whispering voice, it wasn't from this world. And that terrified me more than anything. When I returned home, the feeling of being watched grew even more intense. Every step I took in the building seemed to echo differently, as if someone else was following my movements. I looked at the doors of the apartments as I climbed the stairs, trying to calm my already accelerating heart. When I passed the door to the apartment upstairs, it was locked. No sign of the strange opening from the previous night. It was as if everything had been a dream, but I knew it wasn't. The fear I felt was real. Upon entering my apartment, I locked all the doors and windows more carefully than ever. I spent the rest of the day in silence, with the nervousness building inside me. Every little noise seemed to carry a greater meaning, as if the invisible presence was trying to remind me that it was still there. When the sun began to set and night fell, a familiar dread settled over me. I knew the sounds would return, that the whispering voice and footsteps wouldn't leave me alone. As soon as darkness fell, I heard the first sound, a soft dragging, like something being moved upstairs. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore it, but the sound grew louder. The discomfort turned into terror. Whatever it was back. The empty apartment, the invisible presence, the whispering voice. All of it was around me again, like a mist closing in, growing more suffocating by the minute. The noises seemed louder that night. Every step echoed more intensely, as if the presence upstairs was slowly getting closer, moving directly above my bedroom. I could hear the dragging of something heavy, and more disturbingly, the whispering voice that seemed to be calling me. They weren't words I could understand, but the tone was clear. It was a voice that wouldn't leave me in peace, insistent, as if it wanted something from me. Every sound that came from those walls made my heart beat faster. As I tried to calm myself, I realized the noises were now directly above me. The sound of footsteps was closer than ever, and the voice seemed almost inside the room. I felt my body freeze with pure fear, as the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Whatever was upstairs, it seemed to be watching me, waiting for a response that I didn't know how to give. Every new whisper was like an invisible blow to my state of mind. My mind filled with irrational thoughts. Did the presence know I was there? Was it calling to me, waiting for a reaction? The sound of footsteps continued, now heavier, as if something was moving with purpose. The whispering voice repeated its incomprehensible words, but the tone was clear. It was a call, something demanding a response. The mere thought of answering something I couldn't see or understand terrified me. I tried to convince myself that this couldn't be real, that it was just normal noises from an old building, that my tired mind was creating things that didn't exist. But the truth was, everything felt too real. Every sound, every movement above me was tangible. Fear took root deep inside me, and the thought that the presence could come down and get even closer paralyzed me. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. The presence was there, and it was getting closer. I stayed awake, trying to remain alert. I could no longer ignore what was happening. Whatever it was getting closer, as if it were testing my limits. The whole time, I felt like the voice wanted me to do something. But what? Fear kept me from thinking clearly, but one thing was certain. I couldn't stay still any longer. Something was about to happen, and I had to be ready. The night seemed endless, and every second increased my fear. The sounds from above were no longer just footsteps and furniture being dragged. Now, they seemed to be inside my own apartment. I could hear the creaking of the walls, the groaning of the furniture, as if someone or something was moving through the place without me being able to see it. The feeling that I wasn't alone was almost palpable. Every move I made seemed to echo, as if it were being mirrored by another presence, invisible but real. I got out of bed, my entire body trembling, and walked into the living room. The objects seemed to be in their proper places, but I felt that something was off. There was a heaviness in the air, as if there was a presence I couldn't identify. As I looked around, I began to notice small changes. The chair I had left in one position was slightly turned. The lamp seemed to have been moved a few inches. It wasn't enough to be obvious, but enough for me to notice. Someone, or something, was messing with my things. Fear gripped me. I went to the hallway and once again heard the footsteps, now so close it was as if they were directly above my head. The sound of something, or someone, moving in the ceiling was unmistakable. But the most terrifying thing was when the whispering voice, which had previously seemed distant, now sounded as if it were inside my own apartment. With each passing second, it became clearer that the presence was no longer confined to the floor above. It had come down. It was with me. Terror consumed me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was all just my imagination. But then, the objects in the living room started moving on their own. A glass on the table tilted slightly, with no one touching it. The curtain swayed, even though there was no wind. The chair was slowly pulled back, as if someone invisible were moving it. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. I ran to the bathroom, where I felt safest, trying to pull myself together and find a way out of this terrifying situation. As soon as I entered the bathroom, the first thing I did was turn on the light. The fluorescent glow illuminated the small space, and for a brief moment, I felt some relief. But that relief quickly turned to pure terror when I saw the mirror. There, scrawled with what looked like a wet finger, was a phrase that made me freeze in place. "Why don't you answer?" The words were smudged but still legible, written urgently, as if the invisible presence had been waiting for me the entire time, just waiting for an answer. Panic took over me in a way I had never felt before. The message on the mirror confirmed my worst fear. The voice that had been tormenting me, the footsteps, the moving furniture, it had been trying to communicate with me. I had never understood, had never answered, and now it was too late. Whatever was there, it wasn't human. It was something beyond my comprehension, and it was becoming more present, closer, insistent. I tried to think clearly, but my mind was a mess. The words on the mirror echoed in my head, over and over. "Why don't you answer?" What did that mean? What did they want from me? The whispering voice now seemed to be inside the bathroom, circling around me, and each second became more unbearable. It was as if I were being suffocated by an invisible presence, pressing in on me, demanding an answer I didn't know how to give. I needed to get out of there. I yanked the bathroom door open with a sharp movement, but the sound of the whispering continued to follow me through the house. Every object in my path seemed to move on its own, as if it were alive, part of the malevolent presence that had taken over my apartment. I grabbed my keys and ran for the front door, trembling, desperately trying to escape this nightmare. As I left the apartment, the feeling of being watched still hadn't left me. Even in the hallway, I felt as though the presence was following me. I ran down the stairs until I reached the street, the cold air of the early morning hitting my face. I looked back at the windows of my apartment, but saw nothing. Even so, the feeling that something was in there, watching me, never left. I knew that whatever had been following me, that had written on the mirror and moved the furniture, wasn't finished. That entity, that voice, was still there, waiting for me. And the worst part was, I didn't know if I would ever truly escape from it. If someone asked me, I'd say that night started like any other. With my wife away on a business trip, the house was quiet, and the sense of solitude was actually welcome. I took the chance to relax, stretching out on the couch and turning on the TV. The clock showed a little after 11, and the soft hum of the fan was the only sound aside from the murmur of the television. The house was perfectly still, just the way I liked it. I've never been bothered by silence. In fact, it's something I've always valued. Routine comforts me. The certainty that everything is in its place and under control. I knew that tonight I'd have a few hours of absolute peace before bed. With no obligations the next day, the plan was simple. Watch a few shows on TV, maybe crack open a beer, and then fall into a deep sleep. There was nothing special about a night like this. It was nearing midnight when the unexpected sound of the landline phone echoed through the house. My muscles tensed instantly. It was a strange time for someone to call, especially on the house phone. No one used that line anymore, except for urgent matters. My wife usually called my cell, so who could it be? I stared at the phone for a moment, hesitating before picking up, but the insistent ringing forced me to answer. Hello? My voice was calm, but my heart was already racing. What I heard on the other end was the last thing I expected. Absolute silence. Not the static kind of silence from a dropped line, but an unsettling emptiness, like someone was there, listening, but refusing to speak. I waited a few seconds, then said, hello? Again. But there was no response. Eventually, I hung up, assuming it was some mistake. Who would call at this hour only to say nothing? That discomfort began to grow inside me, but I tried to brush it off. It was surely nothing important. I returned to the couch, trying to recapture the relaxed mood. It was just a wrong number, I thought. Probably someone who dialed the wrong number or hung up. I turned the TV back on, but I couldn't focus on the show. The silence in the house, which had once been comforting, now felt heavy. I kept trying to convince myself it was no big deal, but something about that phone call bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Every small noise in the house seemed amplified, and the tranquility I so valued was now suffocating. It wasn't long before the phone rang again. That sharp sound cut through the silence so abruptly that it made me jump off the couch. I glanced at the clock, midnight exactly. My heart pounded. Whoever it was, they were calling again. For a moment, I considered not answering, but the curiosity and discomfort of not knowing who was on the other end made me pick up the receiver. This time, I answered quickly, as if trying to catch the person off guard. Hello? Once again, only silence. The line was open, but no one said a word. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I waited a few seconds, perhaps hoping the person would finally say something, but nothing happened. The silence on the other end was deafening. Not knowing what else to do, I hung up the phone, this time with more force than I intended. The discomfort grew. Who would be calling me at this hour? Twice, without saying a word. I returned to the couch, trying to convince myself it was just a strange coincidence. But the silence in the house was different now. It was a silence full of expectation, as if something were about to happen. I looked around, watching the shadows on the walls and wondering if I was overreacting. Still, the house felt different, more hostile somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and that phone call was only the beginning. I no longer felt as comfortable. What had once been a peaceful and routine night had become something more sinister. The phone had rung twice, but it seemed as though something invisible had been set in motion in the house, something I couldn't understand but was certainly there, waiting for the next move. The calls continued. After the third time the phone rang, and the same disturbing silence filled the line. I began to feel more than discomfort. I felt anger. Who would do this at this hour? Some stupid prank? I got up and unplugged the house phone, determined to stop any further attempts. The house fell into an oppressive silence, but this time, there was an undercurrent of unease in the air. I hoped that would be the end of the prank. I returned to the couch, but the discomfort had already taken root. Every sound in the house, the creaking of the walls, the faint whisper of the wind outside, seemed intensified. I tried to focus on the TV, but the images passed by without me really processing them. Something was stopping me from relaxing, a feeling that the phone might ring again. The silence, once my refuge, now seemed to carry something threatening, as if the tranquility was on the verge of being broken once more. My cell phone, resting on the side table, suddenly vibrated, making me jump on the couch. I looked at the screen, expecting to see the name of a friend or relative, but it wasn't a known number. It was a private number. The same discomfort I had felt with the landline now multiplied. Who was trying to contact me, now on my cell? I hesitated for a few seconds, but curiosity and fear made me pick up. Hello? The silence lasted for a few moments before it was broken by something different. This time, what I heard wasn't just silence. Heavy breathing came from the other end of the line, low and slow, as if the person was making sure I could hear them. My heart raced, and I felt sweat drip down my forehead. Who are you? I asked, trying to stay calm. Then the breathing was interrupted by a low, almost whispering voice, which murmured only 4 words, I can see you. Those words froze me in place. I immediately hung up, my hands trembling. I ran to the doors and windows, checking each lock in a hurry. I knew they were all locked, but the voice on the phone made everything feel different. Whatever it was, it now felt much closer than I imagined. My breathing was heavy, and I looked around every corner of the house, expecting to see something that would confirm what I feared. Chapter 4. The threatening voice, the words, "I can see you," echoed in my mind, repeatedly. This was no longer a prank or a stupid joke. Someone was watching me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I checked each window and door again. Everything was locked, just as I had left it, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I stood still for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Who could be doing this? My first reaction was to try to rationalize. Maybe it was a friend playing a prank, or even a very strange coincidence. But the voice on the phone was different. It had a cold, calculated tone, and it made me feel a vulnerability I had never experienced before. I looked down at the phone in my hand, the private number still glowing on the screen. It was as if that device had the power to control the house, to take over the silence that once comforted me. I looked out the window into the living room, hoping to see something or someone, but all I saw was darkness. The streetlights barely lit the sidewalks, and there was no movement. However, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every minute that passed seemed to increase the tension in the air, as if someone was out there, hidden in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And I was at their mercy. The phone rang again, this time I cell. My whole body tensed with the sound. I looked at the screen, private number, again. The thought of answering and hearing that voice again filled me with dread, but something inside me, a mix of anger and desperation, made me press the green button. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to sound firm, but my voice was shaking. On the other side, only heavy breathing. I waited for a response, but all I heard was the sound of something moving slowly on the line, as if the person was deliberately playing with me. I knew I couldn't stay here. The house, which once felt like a safe haven, now seemed like a place full of traps, ready to capture me. I grabbed my keys and prepared to leave, but something inside me told me that the danger was closer than I thought. Maybe right outside the door. With each call, the panic inside me grew. The disturbing voice seemed to be playing with me, savoring the fear that had settled into my mind. Even with all the doors and windows locked, I couldn't feel safe. I knew the house was secure, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. The heavy breathing on the line, the whisper of "I can see you," all of it echoed in my head, as if the threat was in every corner of the house. After hanging up the phone for the last time, I sat down on the couch, trying to regain control of the situation. I took deep breaths, repeating to myself that it was just a prank, a bad joke. But the uneasiness wouldn't leave me. The clock on the wall showed 2 in the morning, and the silence in the house was oppressive. Even the sound of the TV seemed distant, muffled by the weight of the tension that hung in the air. Every creak of wood or gust of wind outside felt like a trigger, making me more nervous. I tried to return to watching TV, but my eyes couldn't focus on anything. My body was in a state of high alert, as if I were on the verge of a breakdown. The fear that someone was outside, watching me, consumed my every thought. I got up once more to check the windows and doors. I looked outside again, sweeping the darkness with my eyes. Nothing, just shadows and the emptiness of the night. But what terrified me the most was the thought that maybe I wasn't seeing everything. I knew I had to get out of there. The house was no longer a safe place. I grabbed my phone and called my wife, hoping to find some comfort in her voice. The phone rang several times, but she didn't answer. Maybe she was already sound asleep at the hotel. Now, I was completely alone, and the feeling of isolation only added to the fear. I decided I couldn't stay here any longer, trapped in a house that once seemed so familiar and safe. I grabbed my keys and took one last look around the place. Every room seemed charged with invisible tension, as if the walls were watching my despair. I knew this wasn't just paranoia anymore. The threat was real, and whatever was toying with me knew exactly how to make me feel helpless. I needed to leave immediately, but I wasn't sure if the outside offered anything better. Chapter 6. The unsettling vigilance. I turned off all the lights in the house, hoping that by staying in the dark, I might feel less exposed. My breathing was quick as I walked to the window, looking out onto the dimly lit street. The night seemed darker than usual, and the shadows of the trees danced under the faint glow of the streetlights. There was no one visible outside, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was as if someone was observing me from some hidden spot, waiting for me to let my guard down. I stood there, staring into nothingness, for several minutes. My hands shook as I held the phone. I wasn't sure if I should call the police, but part of me feared they wouldn't take the situation seriously. What if it's just a prank? I thought, what if I'm overreacting? But something in the back of my mind told me this was much more serious. The voice on the phone, the heavy breathing, everything indicated that someone really knew where I was, that they were watching me closely. After some time, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. The feeling of being trapped in my own house was unbearable. I grabbed my jacket and prepared to leave. The idea of facing the darkness outside terrified me, but staying put seemed even worse. I slowly unlocked the front door, hearing the soft click of the lock, and opened it just a crack, enough to peek outside. The street was deserted, but the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite identify. With my heart racing, I took a deep breath and opened the door fully. I stepped outside, feeling the cold wind hit my face, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the darkness, just beyond the reach of the streetlight, a figure was standing, motionless, watching me. It was impossible to make out the face or any details, but the outline of a human figure was unmistakable. My heart leaped into my throat, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. I slowly backed away, never taking my eyes off the figure. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt that it was there because of me. That was the being that had been haunting me all night. In one swift movement, I locked the door and rushed back inside. My whole body trembled with fear, and my mind was consumed by one overwhelming certainty. I was being hunted, and I didn't know what to do next. My heart raced as I locked the door again, my hands trembling as I tried to think of my next move. I ran to the windows, desperate to see if the figure was still outside. What I saw chilled me to the bone. The shadow hadn't moved, still standing there, motionless, as if waiting for me. The weak light from the street lamp didn't fully illuminate it, but I could feel its eyes fixed on me. It seemed impossible, but I knew this wasn't a coincidence. I was being watched in a sick and relentless way. I turned off all the lights in the house, trying to blend into the darkness, hoping the figure would give up and leave. But something inside me knew it wouldn't be that easy. There was something about the way it watched me, the absolute calm with which it remained still, as if it knew exactly how to leave me terrified. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, trying to control my breathing and the thoughts racing through my mind. "I can see you." The words echoed in my head, and the sense of vulnerability left me panicked. I picked up the phone and, with trembling hands, dialed the police. The dispatcher's voice seemed distant as I explained the situation. "Someone is watching me. They're standing outside my house." I could hear my voice faltering as I tried to stay calm. The dispatcher assured me that a patrol car would be sent immediately, but every second felt like an eternity. I looked out the window again, hoping the figure had disappeared, but it was still there, motionless, watching me from afar. Time passed slowly. Every minute felt like an hour as I waited. The figure outside remained still, almost like a living statue, not moving an inch. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The relief was immediate, but something still bothered me. The figure didn't react, didn't run. It simply vanished into the darkness, disappearing before the patrol car arrived. It was as if it had been toying with me the whole time, knowing I'd never be able to catch it. When the police arrived, I quickly went outside to meet them. They searched the area but found no sign of anyone nearby. The officer asked me questions, trying to understand what had happened, but I knew that, no matter how hard I tried to explain, the story would sound absurd. I could hardly believe what I had witnessed myself. The figure had disappeared without a trace, and with it, the immediate terror began to fade, but the fear that it might happen again still suffocated me. The next morning, daylight brought a false sense of relief. What had happened the night before felt like a distant nightmare, but the anxiety still lingered over me. I couldn't shake the thought that the figure might return. I spent the morning in silence, thinking about everything that had occurred. The calls, the heavy breathing, the terrifying words over the phone. It all seemed surreal, as if I had fallen into an invisible trap, not knowing how to escape. The police had assured me there was no one in the area, and while they had been polite and helpful, they couldn't offer me any real answers. They suggested I might have been the victim of some prank or an isolated case of someone disturbing the neighborhood, but I knew there was something more. This wasn't just a joke. It was a calculated pursuit, and the feeling that I was the target continued to eat away at my mind. I walked to the door to grab the morning newspaper, still cautious. When I opened the door, my whole body froze. It wasn't just the newspaper sitting on the doorstep. There was also a folded note, placed carefully. I picked it up with trembling hands, and when I opened it, my heart seemed to stop. The words scribbled on the paper haunted me. Until next time. The handwriting was simple, but the meaning was devastating. This meant it wasn't over. Whoever it was, they were still watching me. The terror was far from over. Panic washed over me again. The figure had disappeared last night, but it made it clear it intended to return. My head spun with questions that would never be answered. Who was this person? What did they want? Why were they stalking me? The note in my hand was proof that everything I had experienced wasn't an illusion. It was real, and the threat was present, even in the light of day. What terrified me most was the idea that next time, the figure might go beyond the simple psychological game. I closed the door in a rush and leaned against it, trying to control the growing despair inside me. The safety I once felt in my own home had been destroyed. The fear of being watched, of being pursued, was now a constant in my mind. Though the police hadn't found anything, I knew this wasn't over. The figure had disappeared for now, but the promise in the note was clear. Until next time was more than a threat. It was a guarantee that the terror had only just begun.